Alright, so there's even more bad news because China's economy just exposed a deeper problem in something called shadow banking.
This shadow banking sector
of shadow banking.
The shadow banking sector is estimated to be worth at least $3 trillion, and that's in China alone, and it all started with real estate.
The country is facing a financial meltdown. Every week, there is a new headline about its impediments.
So the inevitable happened last week and Evergrande collapsed. Now this is huge, and if you haven't been following this story, Evergrande was one of China's biggest real estate developers with more than 1,300 projects across 280 cities. But in 2021, they fell behind on their bond payments to their investors.
2021 was when we saw the company default on its debts, sending shockwaves across the global financial system and in fact triggering a string of defaults across other builders who were either owed money from Evergrande or were expecting Evergrande to complete some contracts for them. Since 2021, we've seen about 40%, or the companies that make up about 40% of China's housing sector default.
Evergrande's debt got so out of control that they owed more money than any other developer in the world, $300 billion. Because the company got so big and it was so connected and other developers relied on them for resources and for loans, after Evergrande defaulted, it was a domino effect, and 40% of China's private real estate developers started to fail as well.
Currently, as we understand it, Evergrande has about $300 billion in debt. It's lost about $80 billion in the last 2 years, and in fact has even been in a trading halt its shares since last year.
$300 billion is a lot of money. To put that in perspective, that represents 2% of China's GDP. In other words, 2% of all the yearly income that China makes. So it's been a long time coming, and now Evergrande filed for Chapter 15 bankruptcy.
Its property giants, so-called property giants, are now filing for bankruptcy protection.
Chapter 15 bankruptcy is a way to protect non-US companies and their assets from their creditors. And because Evergrande is an international company that owes money all over the world, they want to make sure they don't get sued all over the world, especially in the US, which is extremely litigious. But why all of this is important is because the world has a $105 trillion economy. Of that, China is the second biggest at almost $20 trillion, right behind the US. And its downfall is having an impact not only on the Chinese economy, but the US economy as well. And this includes the recent dip in stock prices as well as Bitcoin, and this has led to something even worse. Because there's another developer in China that everyone is looking at right now called Country Garden, which is even bigger than Evergrande. But all of this is leading to a potentially much bigger problem.
But now we also know that a leading trust firm, Zhongrong International, has missed several payments. That's in the shadow banking sector, which is estimated to be about $3 trillion.
So let me explain exactly what's going on in China with this shadow banking crisis, as well as interest rates here in the US, which could be going higher, and I want to talk about a potential downgrade to US banks, including JP Morgan, and what could happen next. So let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for China again. I did not think I'd be making another video about China so soon, but this is big, and as they say, if China's economy gets a cold, the US will get a cold as well. And China's economy is not doing good right now. China's GDP has significantly slowed down, and unemployment is so high that China is trying to hide and stop publishing their data.
Beijing will stop publishing figures for youth unemployment just weeks after it hit a record high in June. Increasingly possible the world's second largest economy is going to miss its 5% growth target that comes after the Chinese central bank delivered a surprise interest rate cut earlier this week.
And to make things worse, housing is going down as well, which is bad for a country that relies so heavily on the real estate economy.
How in scale and importance regarding Country Garden compare with that one? Bigger, worse, more worrisome, less, what?
Is 4 times as large as Evergrande. As a matter of fact, Country Garden, until I think probably the last week, was the #1 largest private real estate developer in China. Now it's #5.
And China's now experiencing deflation, which is when prices are going down, but not in a good kind of way because consumers have stopped spending money.
Consumers aren't really spending. Consumers aren't spending in China, and they're not spending abroad either.
And now Evergrande is in bankruptcy protection, and they're trying to restructure their debt via something called Chapter 15 bankruptcy, which is pretty complicated, but here's exactly what it means. This is something we're going to hear about a lot. So imagine I was Evergrande, an irresponsible child who owned a lot of these Moogle toys, which represents all the people that I owe money to. Now imagine that I had so many of these toys laying around the house that I eventually asked my friends to hold on to these toys for me. And then one day, my parents, which represent the courts, get mad at me, and they decide that I've been neglecting my toys too long, so they're gonna give them all away. So to decide who's owed a Mughal, aka who's owed the money, they're put in charge, which is pretty important because when you're giving toys away, you're gonna have a lot of kids from different neighborhoods who are gonna want a piece of them. That's essentially what's going on with Evergrande, except substitute kids with shareholders, bondholders, employees, and property owners, and substitute the different neighborhoods with the Chapter 15 part. That was the Mughal again, explain it like I'm 5 edition. Now the next stage of China's bad news is an even bigger property developer, the owner of which became the richest woman in China.
She was once Asia's richest woman, but Yang Huiyan has since lost more wealth than any other billionaire in the world in just over 2 years, some $28.6 billion to be exact. All lost as her company, the Chinese property developer Country Garden, falls deeper into a debt crisis. Once China's largest builder by sales, the firm is now at risk of defaulting.
So unlike Evergrande, which people knew about since 2021, Country Garden took people by complete surprise because this was supposed to be China's strongest real estate developer with a ton of cash on their balance sheet. In fact, they promised to deliver 700,000 properties, but so far, they've delivered roughly half of that, and they're having trouble. And they've also missed 2 bond payments to their shareholders, which is also why in the last 30 days, the stock has lost almost 40% in value. And since the beginning of this year, it's down over 72%. The stock is now only worth 10 cents. And because Country Garden has roughly 4 times the amount of projects in development than Evergrande, if they collapse, the question is, kind of selfish, but it's something everyone is wondering, how will the US be affected by this? Presumably, it's going to be the US companies that bought into Country Garden's bonds to get those interest payments. But there are a couple companies here in the US that actually did that. Companies like BlackRock, Fidelity International, UBS, JP Morgan, and a couple others, which is scary because these are all companies we know and probably use. Now, the good news is this. Those numbers are in the couple $100 million worth, which sounds like a lot, but relative to those companies' balance sheets and assets under management, which are in the trillions, this is relatively a small amount. So if the worst was to happen and Country Garden's bonds go to zero, then they should have zero impact on all those companies, theoretically. But as I've said before, whatever happens in China doesn't stay in China. So anything could happen. And unfortunately, the Chinese middle class is already starting to be affected, and it's also starting to impact the shadow banking sector.
Do we have a handle? I mean, if we extend China's problems beyond property and we start thinking about the shadow banking system there, you know, how does that impact the economy overall?
So here's what shadow banking is, because it sounds cloak and dagger and kind of evil, but that's only because it kind of is. So here's the unofficial explanation of how shadow banking works.
If you send me 2 Bitcoin, I'll send you 1 back, right?
Now here's what the official definition of what shadow banking is. Shadow banking describes financial intermediaries that participate in creating credit but are not subject to regulatory oversight. All right, so imagine you're back at Toys R Us again. When you go in there, you know that there are certain rules and expectations. Like when you buy a toy, you're probably gonna get a receipt. And there's a return policy most likely. And what you see is what you get. So if you see $4.95, you're not gonna be like, I'll give you $3.50 for it. There is no haggling. And the owner of Toys R Us will uphold these rules. Those are the basics, and that is the regulated banking industry. But now the shadow banking industry, imagine a playground full of kids. Let's call it Play Club. They could, in theory, just trade the toys with each other because there are no prices, only the prices that they set for themselves. And they could even let each other borrow their toys in exchange for something else because there are no receipts and there are no rules. The only rule is, don't talk about Play Club. That's the shadow banking industry. There's not a lot of official data out there, as you would imagine, but it exists sort of like dark matter in outer space. We can't see it, but we know it's there. It exists in the shadows, outside of regulatory purview. And here's what's crazy. Remember how I said the world's economy was estimated to be worth roughly $100 trillion? Well, it's also estimated that shadow banking is easily worth over $50 trillion. And that was a report from 2019, way before all the inflation and crazy money printing. So at least half of the world's economy participates in shadow banking. And it's probably safe to assume that all banks around the world participate to some degree, including in the high-stakes derivatives market, which is a whole different story, but also part of shadow banking. But the point is that China's shadow banking industry is easily worth over $3 trillion. Some estimates put it much higher. And that industry is heavily dependent on real estate. And those loans are coming due but no one's paying them because those developers are in default. Now, all this news has led to a couple interesting developments here in the US. First, it's partially why the stock market lost 2% last week and why Bitcoin went down to roughly $26,000. Investors are just becoming fearful over China's struggling economy and how that could affect us. But there's also another reason why everything's going down, and that's because the Illuminati, aka the Federal Reserve.
The minutes from the Fed's most recent meeting show that most of the participants in the meeting still saw significant upside risk to inflation that could require further tightening.
And all tightening means is just potentially higher interest rates in September. But so far, the market, aka the CME Fed Watch tool, predicts there's almost a 90% chance that rates will stay the same. But also, remember Fitch? Not Abercrombie & Fitch, but the credit ratings agency which downgraded the US economy? They're back with more bad news.
There may be another downgrade coming for the banking industry. Fitch is warning it may be forced to cut the credit rating of dozens of banks, including big ones like JP Morgan.
Now, so far, thankfully, there hasn't been a downgrade, but there is a possibility. Here's what the ratings look like as of August 2023. And remember, these ratings just represent how safe a bank might be. Bank of America, Bank of New York Mellon, JP Morgan Chase, and State Street are the highest rated, with Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo right below them. All these banks that are highlighted in bold means they're systematically important, aka too big to fail. Again, none of this is a reason to be concerned yet, but it is important to pay attention to. Personally, what I'm doing to protect my money is I am going to the bank as soon as I can and separating my accounts so that none of them hold more than $250,000, so I'm within the insurance limit, just in case if we find out that this shadow banking sector has a huge contagion and it's worse than we originally thought. As for investing, I'm still dollar cost averaging into the market because I'm investing for the long term, and my prediction, even though I think it's completely worthless, is that when the Federal Reserve starts to lower interest rates, which theoretically should happen sometime next year, that's when the market should go up, unless of course China takes everyone down with it, which shouldn't happen, but you know, famous last words. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, so focus on your own investment journey, and as always, have a wonderful rest of your day. Smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to grab your free stocks, links are down below, and then go track them automatically with a spreadsheet linked down below in my Patreon. Love you, thank you so much for watching this video. I'd love to see you back here on Monday, Friday, sometimes a Wednesday. See you soon, bye-bye.